That was a section from Hoisting Aloft, the fourth movement from my piece for classical orchestra Bacchic Europa, which I wrote in the year 2000. It's inspired me to come to the Weimarhalle, which is the main venue for concerts given by the Weimar Stadtkapelle, the city's full-size professional orchestra. The building dates back to the Weimar Republic, but it was completely rebuilt in the 1990s. It now hosts many different events. My school uses it for concerts sometimes. It's currently hosting the annual Yiddish Music Festival, which is co-sponsored by the German and Israeli governments and shows how the city has become fully integrated with a global context during the past 25 years. It was the protests and demonstrations of the peaceful revolution in 1989, coupled with the glasnost and perestroika reforms in the Soviet Union, that eventually led to a relinquishment of totalitarian dominion over Eastern Europe and the associated exposure of the crisis of integrity of the German Democratic Republic. Rules and regulations should be an expression of social justice rather than a tool of repression. This in turn led to the opening of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Iron Curtain that divided East from West, and eventually the reunification of Germany in 1990. After more than half a century of political subjugation, Weimar was welcomed back to the free world. The Bauhaus was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1996, the same time that the Bauhaus University was reconstituted, and the sites of classical Weimar received the same status 2 years later. Thereafter, Weimar, with its rebuilt Weimarhalle, became European Capital of Culture for 1999, only the second city in Germany to be awarded this honour after the capital, Berlin. Yet the world that welcomed Weimar back into its fold remained divided in many ways, even in terms of the adoption of functionalism as a basis for framing cognitive knowledge. Perhaps this was an inevitable consequence of the increased compartmentalization of knowledge associated with the levels of expertise required for research, and perhaps generalized overviews such as this are invitations for ridicule. Nevertheless, a situation whereby experts in theoretical knowledge, ethical knowledge and aesthetic knowledge rarely notice each other is not going to advance the integrity or coherence of society. According to this orthodoxy, the new millennium will be one whereby science takes more and more ground from religion and displaces the ethical imperatives of the past with the neutralism of the future. Ethics itself drops the focus on virtue, given pluralism makes such a notion almost impossible to determine, and thereafter focuses only on justice. Normative art orients itself exclusively on subjective or formalist perspectives, jettisoning the world altogether, freeing itself from the conventions of everyday perception, of purposive behaviour, and of imperatives of work and utility, rejecting Bauhaus values altogether. And nowhere shall the divide be greater than between the realms of metaphysics on the one hand, pertaining to ideas of what exists in the world and how perceptions of that world are derived functionally, and ethics on the other, pertaining to antiquated social theories. However, if, by the turn of the century, the gulf between disparate ideas and conventions was wider than ever, a reappraisal of Weimar heritage offered an opportunity to build bridges and to look to the establishment of a Weimar social theory. Please don't take my terminology too serious, especially if I joke this theory led to the foundation of the International School in Weimar at the turn of the new millennium in the year 2000, and perhaps even to the sum of adoration outlined in my composition Bacchic Europa. I want to apply this to educational values later, but for now I should say that nobody else calls the Weimar social theory by this name, besides me, not as far as I'm aware. The main figures involved in the issue I'll address have no links to the Weimar Ducal Court or the Weimarhalle whatsoever. Nevertheless, I'm going to try to justify this by showing how the heritage of German idealism, and in particular the Weimar identity thesis, was never actually absent. It's played an important role in both the opposing ideas of thought that demand a voice in modern social theory, on the one side the universalism of Adorno and John Rawls, based upon the same of Kant and Hegel, and on the other the pluralism of Habermas and Honneth, based on Herder and other aspects of Hegel. And then I'm going to argue that these disparate approaches can be seen to coexist, without the one having to refute the other, by way of a Weimar social theory based on the principles of critical anti-realism. Adorno's critical theory, which I looked at in a previous episode, was based on a Kantian approach, identifying a transcendental epistemology to explain the mechanism by which the struggle for emancipation led to convention and ultimately subjugation, regulations in service of themselves. As I've said previously, Kant's duty-based ethics, and in particular his categorical imperative, justified its universal condition in terms of epistemological constraints. Kant argued that no empirical knowledge could suffice as a determinant of moral action, given it must always be contaminated by personal interest. Moral will is a priori, formal, and grounded in the structure of reason itself. Kant viewed aesthetic ideas as separate from pure phenomenal experiences and argued, according to Soul, that purposiveness in aesthetic experience is a purely formal property, which is never expressed in some purpose outside itself. Adorno agreed with Kant when he argued that ethical judgments, while able to harmonise the antagonistic opposites of freedom of will and rational necessity, is universally experienced by humans. John Rawls' political theory, which many consider the most important of the 20th century, is also based on Kantian ethics, in that it's duty-based and justified by reason. His writing, like that of Adorno, sought to identify a basis for universal justice and fairness. His books, A Theory of Justice from 1971 and Political Liberalism from 1993, outline an ethical system that seeks to reconcile social equality with personal claims of freedom, which might otherwise lead to inequality. He argued that people of different cultures and faiths will only be able to endorse the legitimacy of democracy if its laws are impossible for any reasonable person to reject. Like Adorno and Rawls, the work of Jürgen Habermas also looked to Kant, although not in the same sense. He and the second generation of critical theorists turn away from universalism as an end in itself, just as Goethe, Schelling and Hegel did the same in the development of the Weimar identity thesis. Yet at the same time he sought to reconcile the notion of universal justice with pluralism by way of discourse and intersubjectivity. I might suggest he was one of the first critical anti-realists, championing a free spirit of inquiry based upon an adaptable approach to the methodological and a pluralist approach to ontology. I should also add that by justice, I'm not necessarily talking about responses to criminality, but the broad spectrum of rights encompassed by law. Different approaches to disparate situations are allowed for, a fusion of positivist and hermeneutic methodologies. Habermas himself said, "Reaching understanding in the life world requires a cultural tradition that ranges across the whole spectrum, not just the fruits of science and technology." He wrote that, given ethical considerations do not have their own structure, traditional questions of ethics, including happiness and virtue, character and ethos, community and tradition, cannot be answered definitively by a singular approach. He argued that matters of justice must involve impartial considerations of the conflicting interests involved, rather than would-be objective ethics. Habermas' theory of justice replaces Kant's categorical imperative with a procedure of justification that's based on agreements reasoned by participants in discourse. Nevertheless, Habermas doesn't rule out a common theory of justice, a moral viewpoint from where competing norms can be impartially adjudicated. Pluralism doesn't imply relativism. Like Kant, Habermas takes the reasoning itself to be universal, given it's focused on what anyone could rationally consider as binding on anyone. It gains its validity in terms of its being satisfactory to everyone's interests, which in turn is grounded in the discourse methodology used to establish it, unlike Kant's transcendental approach, which is grounded epistemically, or Rawls' absolute fairness, which is grounded by the veil of ignorance. The notion that fairness can be established objectively by way of a hypothetical counterfactuality, of nobody knowing in advance their place in society. Habermas said, "Ultimately there's only one criterion by which beliefs can be judged valid, and that is that they're based on agreement reached by argumentation. This means that everything whose validity is at all disputable rests on shaky foundations. It matters little if the ground underfoot shakes a bit less for those who debate problems of physics than for those who debate problems of morals and aesthetics." Habermas wasn't only interested in jettisoning realism and the notion of a monist ontology and everything else embedded in Kantian universalism. He turned the critical eye to Hegel as well, in attempting to understand the crisis in modernity that had led to postmodernism and post-structuralism and every kind of post-Hegelianism imaginable. Habermas's argument has some similarities with that of Adorno, who, as I've said before, argued that after overcoming the dogmas of the past, the Enlightenment project had suffered at the hands of its own dogma. Habermas extended this further to argue that by defining normativity out of its own subjectivity, modernism's valuing of human reason had arrived at the paradoxical situation of undermining the cause of reason and the value of humanity itself. If modernity seeks to continuously overcome the past, but eventually that past is grounded in modernity, then it must overcome itself. Habermas rejected the standard opt-out to this self-destructive cycle, the non-rational alternatives of would-be radical thinkers. In particular, he criticised their perilous political repercussions, which threatened to return to totalitarianism. In particular, he abhorred the reinterpretation of the Holocaust as a singularity, rather than as a synthesis explained by prior conditions, the utilisation of rules and regulations as a tool of repression, rather than a system of justice. He refuted all attempts to artificially cleanse history in order to support would-be uncontaminated human identities. If post-structuralists and other conservatives viewed Buchenwald as an obstacle to a new beginning, then Habermas believed it should act as a starting point itself. Habermas championed modernism, which he argued represented the values of liberal democracy and pluralistic openness. He argued that modernism, just as much now as in the 18th century, is an unfinished emancipatory project, in contrast to the neoconservative conformity of postmodernism. Only modernism had the potential to separate knowledge into different disciplines, science, morality and art, à la Kant, and at the core, into different ontologies. Only modernism could provide the context for free inquiry. However, his focus on a rejection of egocentric subjectivity in favour of intersubjective thought as an alternative to the endless stages of opposition to Hegelian reason left some unresolved problems. Habermas's discourse ethics remains essentially formalistic. It restricts itself to justice and does not address many other factors determining the subjective parameters of social systems, including the qualitative. It restricts itself to matters that might be solved by rational argument, which excludes aesthetics and all cultural value contents. The Weimar identity theorists never ducked these questions in the same way. Kant and Hegel both delved into the nature of reason specifically so that they could comprehend these issues of qualitative meaning, the rationale behind those things that cannot be rationalised. They might have come up with a Weimar social theory themselves if Napoleon hadn't ridden into town. But matters have moved forward since then towards the goal of a social theory that can address a full breadth of the ethical and aesthetical alongside the pluralist metaphysical. Indeed, it's the third generation of critical realists that interests me today, and in particular Alex Honneth, who, building upon the past, constructed his thesis on the work of Habermas, Adorno and Foucault, taking the lead in turn from Nietzsche and Heidegger. Having introduced him in this way, I must add that actually Honneth was not at all taken by the idealist heritage. He said the contemporary age is a post-metaphysical age, whatever that means, that has refuted all idealistic speculation, the philosophy of consciousness as he termed it. Nevertheless, not everything of the Kantian tradition was to be considered useless. In fact, Honneth decided to ground his own social theory in fragmentary schemes explored by Hegel while he was living in Saxe-Weimar and writing his Phenomenology of Spirit, even as Napoleon rode on horseback outside. In particular, Honneth was interested in Hegel's notions of the dialectic movement from the natural to the absolute, and specifically how this pertains to ethical life. Honneth argued that in order to justify our own normative claims, we have to provide a kind of teleological account of history. This involves a commitment to the idea that modern forms of Sittlichkeit, or ethical life, are in some sense superior to those that have come before. A consistent self-understanding of our moral practices presupposes historical moral progress. Honneth continued the Frankfurt School project, focusing on identifying social progress, but he wanted to reorient the focus away from impediments to progress, as they might exist in economics and the economics of culture, as expressed by the Marxist in Adorno. Instead, he chose to analyse qualitative ethics by way of an expression of grievance, by situating injustice in violations of moral expectations. Honneth said that all relationships are established through a process of social struggle, and that affective expressions of indignation and outrage are generated when claims to recognition are rejected. It's this that reveals the nature of normative judgments, both as regards the metaphysics of plural ontologies, although he didn't use these words, and the legitimacy of social structures. If one definition of social struggle oriented on resolve and peace means coming with your family to the Sommerrodelbahn at the Inselsberg-Funpark, about an hour from Weimar in the Thuringian forest, then it seems as good a place as any to consider that if the goal is to build bridges between the would-be external world of metaphysics on the one hand and the would-be internal world of subjective ethics and aesthetics on the other hand, then Honnett's model, whereby the normative ideal of a just society, which is subjective, is revealed by the historical struggle among individual or social groups for recognition, perceived objectively, takes things a step further. It's the essence of moral progress itself. And there at the end of the rainbow of Hegelian absolutist freedom is a modernist social theory based on German idealism and the Weimar identity thesis, seeking the middle ground whereby there's a refutation of the value neutrality associated with nomological science, yet there's also the possibility of theoretical approaches that produce objective and theoretical accounts. Such a methodology will deprive interpretation of the privileged status of the observer, yet also enable a sense of impartiality. In other words, if the Kantian universalism embedded in Adorno's epistemics and Rawls' justice is subsumed by the Hegelian moralism driving Habermas's fusion of science and hermeneutics by way of discourse, and Honnett's quest for semantic purposiveness underpinning the recognition and respect that ought to be shown to others, then the dialectical sublation points to the four levels of the Weimar social theory. First is the ethical and aesthetical, incorporating the qualitative subjective that provides the possibility for open-mindedness and respect for the integrity of others. Then there's the methodological, incorporating adaptable, inquiry-based strategies based on the principles of critical anti-realism. Third is the metaphysical, incorporating pluralism above monism. And fourth is the epistemological, incorporating the autonomy and simultaneity of different forms of knowledge. In terms of educational values, at least those suited to an international school oriented on global citizenship, this points to an inquiry-based learning committed to the same values of open-mindedness, pluralism, and above all else, respect for the integrity of others. And this in turn points to a learning environment where students are conducting in-depth investigations, posing open-ended questions, gathering and analysing data from a broad perspective, generating explanations, formulating and communicating conclusions, and thereafter reflecting on the investigation as a whole. These values are not a set of solutions any more than Habermas's discourse ethics established a set of normative guidelines in itself. Quite the opposite. They can be taken in directions that imply contradiction and paradox. They do not in themselves answer Honnett's question of how we can overcome moral grievance. Nevertheless, they represent a starting point, the starting point that began this inquiry and that will end it too. Before my children finish with the Rodelbahn, I'll finish this particular episode by playing another section from my own orchestral piece, Bacchic Europa, this time the last movement. Thanks for listening.